The sun hung low over the desert highway, casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt as Marcus Thompson pulled his motorcycle into the dusty parking lot of a roadside diner somewhere in rural Nevada. The chrome on his bike gleamed despite the layer of road dust, and his leather jacket bore the subtle wear of thousands of miles traveled. At 42 years old, Marcus carried himself with a quiet confidence that came from years of discipline, though few would guess the depth of his training just by looking at him. He had spent 15 years as a Navy SEAL, completing multiple tours in some of the world's most dangerous locations, earning commendations for valor that now sat in a box in his garage, rarely seen and never discussed. After retiring from service 2 years ago, he had been searching for peace, trying to reconcile the man he had become in war with the man he wanted to be in civilian life. This cross-country motorcycle trip was part of that journey, a solitary pilgrimage to clear his mind and find some semblance of normalcy. As Marcus dismounted and removed his helmet, he noticed the row of motorcycles lined up near the diner's entrance, at least a dozen choppers with custom paint jobs and aggressive styling. He recognized the insignia immediately, patches sewn onto leather vests that proclaimed allegiance to a motorcycle club known for its exclusionary views and history of violence. His instincts, honed by years of assessing threats in hostile territory, told him to be cautious, but he was tired, hungry, and his gas tank was running low. This was America, his country, the nation he had served and bled for, and he refused to be intimidated in his own homeland. He locked his helmet to his bike and walked toward the diner entrance, his movements fluid and controlled, betraying none of the alertness that hummed beneath his calm exterior. The moment Marcus stepped through the door, the atmosphere shifted palpably. Conversations died mid-sentence, and every head turned in his direction. The diner was small, with worn vinyl booths lining the windows and a long counter with spinning stools that had seen better decades. Seated throughout the space were members of the motorcycle club, their vests adorned with patches that spoke of chapters, ranks, and ideologies that made Marcus's jaw tighten. At the largest booth in the back sat a massive man with a shaved head covered in tattoos that crept up his neck, his arms thick as tree trunks, and a sneer that seemed permanently etched onto his face. This was clearly their leader, and his cold blue eyes locked onto Marcus with undisguised hostility. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a name tag that read Sarah, looked at Marcus with an expression that mixed sympathy with fear, silently pleading with him to turn around and leave. But Marcus had faced down armed insurgents in Fallujah, had conducted covert operations behind enemy lines in Afghanistan, and he would not be chased away from a public diner by bigots, no matter how numerous they were. Marcus chose a stool at the counter, positioning himself so he could see the entire room reflected in the mirror behind the coffee pots and pie display. Sarah approached hesitantly, her order pad shaking slightly in her hands. "What can I get you, honey?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus ordered coffee and a burger, his tone polite and calm, refusing to acknowledge the hostile stares burning into his back. As Sarah hurried away, one of the bikers, a lanky man with a patchy beard and swastika tattoo visible on his forearm, stood up and sauntered toward the counter. He positioned himself uncomfortably close to Marcus, invading his personal space with deliberate aggression. "You lost, boy." The biker sneered, his breath reeking of beer and tobacco. Marcus took a slow breath, his hands resting calmly on the counter. "Just passing through," he replied evenly, his voice steady and betraying none of the adrenaline beginning to course through his system. "This ain't your kind of place." Another biker called out from a nearby booth, his comment drawing cruel laughter from his companions. "Maybe you should get back on that bike and find somewhere more appropriate." The word dripped with venom, and Marcus felt the familiar cold focus settling over him. The same mental state he had entered before countless missions, where emotion receded and pure tactical thinking took over. The situation escalated quickly when the leader rose from his booth, his bulk making the floorboards creak as he approached. He was at least 6'4" and probably weighed 280 pounds, most of it muscle layered with the kind of bulk that came from both lifting weights and consuming massive quantities of food and alcohol. His vest was covered with patches proclaiming his status, including several that referenced violence and racial supremacy. "We don't serve your kind here," he growled, stopping directly behind Marcus. So close that Marcus could feel the heat radiating from his body. Sarah, the waitress, appeared with Marcus's coffee, her hands shaking so badly that the cup rattled against the saucer. "Please," she whispered to the leader, whose name patch read Crusher. "Don't start trouble. I already called Sheriff Patterson." Crusher laughed, a deep, booming sound devoid of humor. "Patterson is probably finishing his 6th beer at the tavern. By the time he gets here, our friend will be long gone, won't you, boy?" His massive hand descended toward Marcus's shoulder, intent on grabbing him and physically throwing him out of the diner. This was his fatal mistake, the moment where ignorance and arrogance collided with highly specialized training and experience. In a movement so fast that most of the bikers barely registered it, Marcus's hand shot up and intercepted Crusher's wrist, his fingers finding the precise pressure points that would cause maximum pain while preventing the larger man from completing his grab. Wait, Marcus stood fluidly rotating Crusher's arm in a motion that forced the biker leader onto his toes to prevent his elbow from dislocating. "I don't want trouble," Marcus said calmly, his voice carrying a note of authority that made several of the bikers hesitate. "I'm going to release you, and we're all going to calm down." But Crusher, humiliated in front of his crew, was beyond reason. The moment Marcus released him, he roared with rage and threw a massive haymaker punch that would have knocked out most men if it had connected. Marcus simply wasn't there anymore, having stepped inside the arc of the punch with practiced ease. His counter was economical and devastating, a short palm strike to Crusher's solar plexus that drove the air from his lungs and left him gasping and bent over. Before any of the other bikers could react, the situation exploded into chaos as 5 of them rushed Marcus simultaneously, convinced that their numbers would overwhelm him. What followed was a masterclass in close-quarters combat that would have been impressive, even if it hadn't been taking place in the cramped confines of a rural diner. The first biker to reach Marcus, the lanky one with the patchy beard, threw a wild right cross that Marcus ducked under while simultaneously sweeping the man's front leg, sending him crashing into a table that collapsed under his weight. The second attacker came from Marcus's left, attempting a tackle that Marcus redirected with a hip throw that sent the biker sailing over the counter, scattering coffee cups and plates in a tremendous crash. The third and fourth came together, one high and one low, a coordinated attack that showed they had at least some experience fighting as a unit. Marcus jumped backward onto one of the spinning counter stools, using it as a platform to launch a devastating kick into the face of a high attacker, while using the same motion to spin and drive his other heel into the temple of the low attacker. Both men dropped like puppets with cut strings, unconscious before they hit the ground. The fifth biker, showing more wisdom than his companions, pulled a knife from his belt, a wicked-looking blade with a serrated edge designed to cause maximum damage. The appearance of the knife changed the dynamics entirely, and Marcus's demeanor shifted from defensive to coldly efficient. Years of training in weapons disarmament took over as the biker lunged forward with a clumsy overhand stab that telegraphed his intention from a mile away. Marcus sidestepped, trapped the knife arm, and executed a textbook disarm that involved breaking 2 of the biker's fingers and relieving him of the blade in less than 2 seconds. Marcus tossed the knife through the serving window into the kitchen, where it clattered harmlessly to the floor, then delivered a precise strike to the biker's carotid artery that dropped him into unconsciousness without causing permanent damage. The entire engagement had lasted less than 30 seconds, and 6 bikers were now out of commission, groaning on the floor or slumped unconscious against overturned furniture. The remaining members of the motorcycle club stared in shocked disbelief, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Crusher, having recovered enough breath to stand upright, stared at Marcus with a mixture of fear and rage, his hand moving toward the small of his back, where Marcus knew he likely carried a firearm. "Don't," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying a weight of authority that came from years of command. "I was special operations for 15 years. I've disarmed insurgents who were better trained and more motivated than you. If you pull that weapon, I will take it from you, and someone will get seriously hurt, possibly killed. Is your pride worth dying over?" The words hung in the air like a physical presence, and Crusher's hand slowly moved away from his back. The leader of the motorcycle club was many things, but he wasn't stupid, and he could see in Marcus's eyes the absolute certainty that the threat was not a bluff. Marcus continued, his voice calm but unyielding. I served this country in places you couldn't pronounce, fighting people who would have killed every person in this diner without a second thought. I did it so that everyone, including you, could live free. And this is how you treat a fellow American? With hatred and violence based on nothing more than the color of my skin? The silence in the diner was absolute, broken only by the groaning of the injured bikers and the soft sound of Sarah crying behind the counter, overcome by stress and fear. It was at this moment that the door to the diner burst open and Sheriff Patterson rushed in, his hand on his service weapon, his face flushed from hurrying. He was a weathered man in his late 50s, with gray hair and the kind of bearing that suggested he had been in law enforcement for decades. He took in the scene with practiced eyes, seeing the overturned furniture, the injured bikers, and Marcus standing calmly in the center of it all, not even breathing hard. Somebody want to tell me what happened here? The sheriff demanded, his eyes moving from Marcus to Crusher and back again. Before anyone could answer, Sarah emerged from behind the counter, her fear giving way to anger. These men attacked this gentleman for no reason other than racism, Sheriff. He defended himself, and he showed more restraint than they deserved. If he hadn't been here, if he'd been anyone else, they would have beaten him half to death, and we all know it. Several of the local patrons who had been cowering in their booths nodded in agreement, finding courage now that law enforcement had arrived. One elderly man stood up, his voice shaky but determined. She's right, Patterson. I saw the whole thing. These boys started it, and this young man finished it while barely breaking a sweat. Damnedest thing I ever seen. Sheriff Patterson studied Marcus for a long moment, then seemed to come to a decision. You got ID, son? Marcus slowly reached into his jacket and pulled out his wallet, extracting his driver's license and his military identification card. The sheriff examined both, and his eyebrows rose when he saw the designation on Marcus's military ID. Navy SEAL, he said, his tone changing from suspicion to respect. That explains a lot. How many tours? 4, Marcus replied simply. Iraq and Afghanistan, primarily. Some other places I can't discuss. The sheriff handed back the ID and turned to Crusher and his crew, his expression hardening. You boys are going to have a choice. You can press charges against this man for assault, in which case I'll have to arrest all of you for assault, battery, hate crimes, and probably a few other charges I'll think of on the way to the station. Or you can get your injured buddies out of here, pay for the damages to this establishment, and count yourselves lucky that Mr. Thompson here didn't put you all in the hospital. Which is it going to be? Crusher looked at his crew, then at Marcus, then at the floor, his moment of decision visible in the slump of his shoulders. We'll pay for the damages, he muttered, the fight completely gone from his voice. Over the next 20 minutes, the bikers collected their wounded, several of whom were still groggy from unconsciousness, and began filing out of the diner. Crusher pulled a thick wad of bills from his pocket and dropped them on the counter, more than enough to cover the broken furniture and dishes. As he turned to leave, Marcus spoke up. Wait. Crusher turned back, wariness in his eyes. Marcus stepped closer, his voice low enough that only Crusher could hear. I could have killed you and at least 3 of your men in the time it took to disable you. I didn't because despite everything, I still believe people can change. You're clearly a leader, and people follow you. You have a choice about what kind of leader you're going to be. You can keep spreading hate and violence, and eventually you'll run into someone who won't show the restraint I did. And you or your men will die. Think about it. Crusher stared at Marcus for a long moment, emotions warring across his face, then nodded once, curtly, and walked out of the diner without another word. The rumble of motorcycles starting up filled the air, and then the club was gone, leaving only dust settling in the parking lot and the stunned silence of the remaining patrons. Sheriff Patterson sat down on the stool next to Marcus, gesturing for Sarah to bring coffee. That was either very brave or very foolish what you did, he said, studying Marcus with shrewd eyes. I've known Crusher and his crew for years. They've been trouble since before I pinned on this badge, but they've never been taken down like that. Hell, they've never been taken down at all. Most people just avoid them. Let them have their little kingdom out here in the desert where they can pretend their hateful ideology matters. Marcus sipped his coffee, which Sarah had refreshed with shaking hands. I've seen real evil, Sheriff. I've seen what happens when good people stay silent and let hate grow unchecked. I'm not saying those men are redeemable, but I gave them a choice. What they do with it is up to them. The sheriff nodded slowly. You know, my son served in the Marines. 2 tours in Helmand Province. He came back different, quieter. He don't talk about what he saw over there, but I can see it in his eyes sometimes. I recognize that look, and I see it in your eyes too. Whatever you boys went through over there, it's something the rest of us can't understand. But I want you to know that not everyone in this country has forgotten what you did for us. There are still good people out here who appreciate your service. As Marcus finished his meal, which Sarah insisted was on the house, several of the local patrons approached to shake his hand and thank him. The elderly man who had testified on his behalf introduced himself as Albert, a Korean War veteran who had been decorated for valor at the Chosin Reservoir. Son, what you did today was more than self-defense, Albert said, his weathered hand gripping Marcus's firmly. You showed those boys that their hate has consequences, but you also showed them mercy. That takes a bigger man than most. Where are you headed on this journey of yours? Marcus smiled, the first genuine smile he had managed in hours. Nowhere in particular. Just riding, trying to find some peace. Albert nodded sagely. Peace is hard to find when you carry war inside you, but it's out there, son. Keep looking. And maybe, just maybe, you already started finding it today by standing up for what's right. That's what we fought for. All of us veterans across all the wars. The right for everyone to be treated with dignity and respect in this country, regardless of what they look like or where they come from. Marcus left the diner an hour later, after helping Sarah and the owner clean up the mess from the fight and ensuring that they had his contact information in case the bikers returned or the sheriff needed a statement. As he mounted his motorcycle and secured his helmet, Sarah ran out with a paper bag. I packed you some sandwiches and cookies for the road, she said, tears streaming down her face. Thank you for what you did. My daughter is dating a black man, and she's been terrified to bring him home because of clubs like that. You reminded me today that there are still heroes in this world, people willing to stand up against hate. You reminded me that the good guys can still win. Marcus accepted the bag, touched by her gesture. The good guys do win, Sarah. Not always immediately, and not without cost, but in the long run, love and justice prevail over hate and ignorance. It's what I have to believe after everything I've seen. As Marcus rode away from the diner, the setting sun painting the desert in shades of orange and purple, he felt something shift inside him. For 2 years, he had been haunted by the things he had done in war, the lives he had taken in service of his country, the impossible choices that had no good answers. He had wondered if his service had mattered, if the sacrifices made by him and his brothers in arms had any meaning in a world that still seemed filled with hatred and division. But today, in a dusty diner in rural Nevada, he had been reminded why he had served in the first place. Not for glory, not for recognition, but to protect the fundamental principle that all people deserve to live free from violence and oppression. He had faced down hatred with courage and responded to violence with controlled force and ultimately mercy. He had shown those bikers that their bigotry had consequences, but had also shown them a path to something better. Whether they took that path was beyond his control, but he had planted a seed, and sometimes that was enough. 3 months later, Marcus received an unexpected letter at his home in San Diego. It was postmarked from Nevada, and the return address was unfamiliar. Inside was a short, handwritten note that read, Mr. Thompson, I don't expect you to forgive me or my crew for what we did that day. I'm writing to tell you that your words stuck with me. I've been doing a lot of thinking about the kind of man I want to be and the legacy I want to leave. I dissolved the club. Most of the guys wanted to keep going down the same path, but a few of us decided we were done with hate. I've started working with a veterans outreach program, helping guys who are struggling after they come home. It ain't much, but it's something. I wanted you to know that what you did that day mattered. You changed my life, and probably saved it too. I was headed down a dark road that would have ended in prison or death, Thank you for showing me there was another way. Respectfully, John Crusher Morrison. Marcus read the letter 3 times, then carefully folded it and placed it in the box with his military commendations. This, he thought, was worth more than all the medals combined. This was proof that one person standing up for what was right could create ripples that spread far beyond the initial moment. This was the peace he had been searching for on that desert highway, the knowledge that his capacity for violence, honed through years of military service, could be channeled into protecting the innocent and perhaps even redeeming the guilty. The story of what happened in that Nevada diner spread through veteran networks and online communities, not because Marcus sought recognition, but because Sheriff Patterson mentioned it to a reporter during an interview about rural crime. The story resonated with thousands of people who were tired of feeling helpless in the face of hatred and bigotry. Marcus began receiving letters from other veterans, people of color who had faced similar situations, and even former members of hate groups who had found the courage to leave. He realized that his solitary journey had become something larger, a symbol of the truth that courage and principle could still triumph over ignorance and hate. Marcus started speaking at schools and community centers not about his combat experiences, but about the importance of standing up for others, of meeting hatred with strength but also with the wisdom to show mercy. He talked about how real strength wasn't found in dominating others, but in protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, and in offering redemption to those who had lost their way. Years later, Marcus would look back on that day in the diner as a turning point, the moment when his military training and combat experience found new purpose in civilian life. He had learned that the battles worth fighting weren't always against foreign enemies, but sometimes against the darkness that existed in people's hearts. And he had learned that winning those battles didn't always require violence, but required the courage to stand firm in one's principles, the wisdom to use force only when necessary, and the compassion to offer a better path to those consumed by hate. The motorcycle trip that had started as a solitary quest for peace had become a journey toward purpose, and Marcus had discovered that the service he had given to his country in war zones halfway around the world was just the beginning of the service he could provide at home. The fight for justice, dignity, and equality was ongoing, fought not with rifles and grenades, but with courage, compassion, and the unwavering belief that all people deserve to be treated with respect regardless of the color of their skin, their background, or their beliefs. And in standing up for those principles in a desert diner against overwhelming odds, Marcus Thompson had proven that one person armed with training, courage, and moral clarity could indeed make a difference, could change hearts, and could help bend the arc of the universe just a little bit more toward justice. That was the real victory, the one that mattered most, and the one that would continue to inspire others long after the details of that confrontation had faded into memory. The good ending wasn't just that Marcus walked away unharmed, or that the bikers were defeated, but that seeds of change were planted that day, seeds that would grow into a better future for everyone involved, proving that even in the darkest moments, hope and redemption remain possible for those brave enough to reach for them.